So today our webinar is going to be on Vietnam market entry and regulations, and our speaker today is going to be Ashwin Pillay. I'll speak a little bit about him shortly. So a little bit about us. We're a leading independent brand management agency that develops, distributes, and manages brands across Asia. And our work so far is shown here. Here are some of the brands that we've worked with in the past and that we currently work with right now. And like I mentioned, our speaker today is Ashwin Pillay. He's our commercial manager here, and he has a deep and holistic understanding across both China, Southeast Asia, and so including Vietnam as well, which is what this webinar is going to be discussing today. And he has experience across categories, including food and beverage, alcohol, FMCG, and others. And then our agenda today is we're basically going to go through the step-by-step process of market entry into Vietnam. So covering, starting off with an overview of the market and then going into IP and trademarking considerations, understanding the Vietnamese consumer, localization considerations, and then talking a little bit about the free trade agreements that Vietnam is in and import regulations. And then we're going to talk about the different sales channels that are available and then the different market entry methods, including establishing an entity, and then also including working with a local distributor and how to find a local distributor. And then we're also going to talk about the e-commerce and social commerce channels, and then going in a little bit into brand building, into content, the type of content that you want to produce in Vietnam, and then also influencer marketing as well. And then the last little section is going to be about testing and learning. And then we're going to talk about business etiquette in Vietnam. And finally, we're going to end off by discussing a little bit about the advantages and challenges of entering the market in Vietnam. And we will have a little Q&A session at the end. So if you have any questions, please feel free to send them through and we'll get to them in the end. With that, I'm going to pass it over to Ashwin so he can get started. Give me a second to make you host.
Well, thank you, Sandra.
Yeah, can you share your screen?
That's good now. And one moment, allow me to share my screen. Is that coming up clearly?
Yeah, I can see that.
Perfect. Well, thank you everybody for joining today's session. And thank you, Sandra, for the introduction. This is Ash here, Commercial Manager at Redfin Digital, based between our Shanghai and Ho Chi Minh offices. Currently based in Ho Chi Minh with the team down here. And this session is, as Sandra mentioned, focusing on Vietnam market entry. So we're covering quite a spectrum of different topics, which is broadly speaking to brands that come from all walks of life, but going through holistically the considerations and approaches that brands need to take into account when they're looking at this market. We've got quite a fair bit to cover today. So if you've got any particular questions that pop up, feel free to share them in the chat and we'll go through them during the Q&A session towards the end. So to start off the session today, I'm going to speak to the step-by-step process of market entry and brand building in the Vietnamese market. Very characteristical of tackling most Asian markets. I won't dive into each segment too specifically or in too much detail as we go into a bit more depth for later in the presentation. But you'll see a timeline based on essentially getting a holistic understanding of whether the Vietnamese market is a fit for you and your brand and product. The Vietnamese consumer landscape is very dynamic. E-commerce market share is nowhere near as developed as it is with the likes of China. Consumers are extremely price sensitive. So going through that research and strategy process at your initial look at the Vietnamese market is very important. And generally that would start off with looking at a category understanding or market opportunity assessment to see what the size of the pie looks like. Regardless of whether you plan to launch in Vietnam this year or 5 to 10 years from now, getting your IP protected and in place is a crucial step. And one of those things that's a small investment at the initial stage of when you're looking at Vietnam, but the long-term protection and benefits of having it in place can't really be quantified, as with most first-to-file systems, but I'll go into a bit more detail around that process in the trademark section. Focus groups and social listening. So getting an understanding from, okay, you see that there's an opportunity in the market. The total sales value across offline and online validates market entry. The next step is understanding what does the category mean in Vietnam, understanding who your core target consumers are, This can be done through focus groups, online social listening through the likes of TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, etc. At this point, through focus groups, you can look at what levels of localization do you need to go through. And we'll touch on a bit more detail on the discrepancies between Vietnam and other Southeast Asian markets when it comes to what degree do you localize for market later in the presentation. Understanding where does your country of origin sit when it comes to free trade agreements and import regulations. Vietnam has a number of free trade agreements in place. It's important to be able to capitalize on those and be aware of those. Pricing and sales channels, so understanding from an e-commerce and an offline bricks and mortar perspective, what does pricing look like? And that will ultimately dictate what your market entry method is. Is it going to be one, establishing an entity in Vietnam, a JV, or looking at working with a distributor in market? This then feeds onto your e-commerce play. You've got your offline channels and your offline execution in place. Where are you going to focus? Is that going to be Lazada, Shopee, Tiki? Is it going to be on social commerce with TikTok really on the rise in the market? And then following that launch across e-commerce, looking at what your marketing strategy is to ultimately get the product in the hands of Vietnamese consumers and build awareness and ultimately sales through offline and online in the China market. It's an important piece in this session where I'll speak to the importance of running test and learn program once you launch online. And that's essentially an intensive period upon launch of getting an understanding of what really works for your brand in this market across types of influencers, across different types of AVs and visuals that you'll use on your Lazada, Shopee, or Tiki stores. And that's relevant also across the different media channels that you're running across as well, whether that be TikTok, Instagram, or Facebook. So looking at the macro landscape in Vietnam, Vietnam certainly went through a difficult time with hard lockdowns throughout the entire country. But overall, we're starting to see a real bounce back in terms of consumer goods consumption. Interestingly, if you were to compare Vietnam with China, when it comes to a proportion of market share in terms of total retail, e-commerce is significantly smaller. But for brands considering the Vietnamese market, it's important to have that in your thought process when it comes to your market entry strategy, that offline is very, very important. In terms of the way that offline retail is segmented within the Vietnamese market, it's extremely segmented between general trade, specific category, specific stores, wet markets, etc. So understanding, or convenience as well. So understanding where your products and brand are going to play is crucial. And that comes back to also evaluating and understanding who you're going to be working with when it comes to a distribution perspective, and doing that due diligence to make sure that your partner in place is the right one. So looking at e-commerce retail sales by category, food and beverage certainly reigns supreme in the market. Interestingly, this is certainly bolstered by local apps such as Grab. They have really high penetration rate among consumers, which has certainly driven the frequency and usability of e-commerce to purchase food and beverage products. Apparel and footwear very closely behind, followed by beauty, personal care, etc. This is also driven by a very, very young demographic that is purchasing online in Vietnam, very much driven by Gen Z. Taking into consideration, if you're a beauty, personal care, cosmetics oriented brand, offline still remains a crucial channel for product experience and testing. So looking at the growth in e-commerce, so overall in the Vietnamese market, it's certainly one of the fastest growing e-commerce markets in Asia. This gives insight into the importance of brands looking at this market, the opportunity that presents itself in terms of first mover advantage when you're looking at this market, compared with the likes of China, Singapore, and other markets that have a very sophisticated and competitive and saturated, for lack of a better term, e-commerce market. The number of brands that are selling on these online marketplaces is significantly less. So there's certainly a significant opportunity for brands to penetrate the market. So it's really important to consider, all said, that it is only 7% of total retail. So that brings back the importance of the offline channels when it comes to brand consideration for entering the market. IP trademarking in Vietnam. So I know there are a few people on the webinar today that are long savvy China hats. So it's a very similar process with Vietnam as it is with mainland China. It's a first to file process. Redfin can help with this. It's a fairly straightforward process, but regardless of your timeline when entering the Vietnamese market, ensuring that you get your IP in place is important. Use a legal rep, a legal person, or a authorized firm to help you with that, and get that IP in place and ensure that all of your logos, your brand names, etc., are in place before you look at doing anything that would potentially expose your brand and market. So if I step back to looking at the market entry cycle of coming into Vietnam, when you take into consideration the market opportunity and the category assessment, and validating that there's a market, before you move on to focus groups and understanding your consumer profiles, you should be getting that trademark in place, because ultimately, if you don't have at least the filing in place, that's compromising your brand's exposure in the market. So make that certainly a key point to tick off the box when you do decide that Vietnam's a market that you want to look at. Looking at consumer demographics, it's quite starking to see the amount of time that's spent during the day online. It's important to take into consideration that TikTok, YouTube Shorts, platforms that are very, very focused on product discovery are very big in the Vietnamese market. And this is also, as I mentioned, bolstered by such a fierce and tech-savvy Gen Z consumer market in Vietnam. You'll see that in terms of gender profiling, it's slightly female skewed. Hence, you can see the proportion of sales and growth in terms of categories such as mother and baby, personal care, beauty, cosmetics, fashion are among the highest when it comes to online penetration, simply because that demographic between 15 to 64 is 68.6%. So, and that's of the total population. Interestingly, when you look at Vietnam from a regionality perspective, it's the North and South are extremely different. It's not one country. For a lot of the brands that we work with in market, and most brands for that matter, they'll work with partners that are regional specific. So they'll have one partner in the North, one partner in the South, and one that can fulfill the middle, though it's not a priority. If you look at the three main centers in Vietnam holistically, you've got Ho Chi Minh in the south, Da Nang in the middle, and Hanoi in the north. It's important to take into consideration that outside of these main hubs, there is significant price sensitivity. So working with a distributor that can help facilitate fulfillment into these regions and these hubs is key. 39% roughly of the population of Vietnam lives in urban areas. So ensuring that you have a distributor in place in these regions, or you set up and focus your retail in these hubs, is key as an initial touch point and a focus for your market entry into the region. What do Vietnamese consumers place the most value on? Certainly, they're a extremely value conscious consumer. So when you're looking at your mode of entry coming into the market, looking at price sensitivity is very important. They're far less brand loyal than a lot of other consumers in other Asian markets. So ensuring that when you're looking to come into this market, do not perceive it as being necessarily a China play, where it is going to be a high value item at high volume. It's important to take into consideration that maintaining competitive cost and pricing in the market will keep you alive in this space. And as I mentioned, that comes back to Vietnamese consumers being among the least brand loyal. And inflation and worries have certainly caused consumers in the market to be a lot more price sensitive. There's a lot of local competitive brands in the market. So it's an important aspect to take into consideration when you're going through that testing and market validation process, understanding who your competitors are in the market, benchmarking how you want to position, and building your pricing structure from there. So looking at consumer testing, so focus groups and social listening are a very, very cost-effective mechanism and methodology to understand whether the Vietnamese market is for your brand and product. Focus groups are inexpensive. They can be scaled. You can develop a structure of focus groups that target on a specific consumer demographic. For example, we're doing a number of focus groups for mother and baby specific product for the Vietnamese market. And these are scalable, low cost, and can give some extremely crucial insights into your brand, your product offering, your pricing, your visual appeal. Does what the functions and values of what your brand represents tailor and accommodate to what Vietnamese consumers want? So would strongly recommend this as a low cost approach to getting a good understanding and gauge of whether your brand actually fits for the market. And obviously pricing. It's a very powerful methodology to get feedback on whether, okay, the consumer has seen your product, your brand, your packaging, your unique selling points. What ultimately would they pay for the product? What other products and brands would that consumer actually compare it to is an important element as well. And that will also help you to understand from an offline and online sales perspective, where are the key channels that consumers are actually going to purchase your product, which ultimately feeds into your strategy with working with a potential distributor and market, or if you are going to set up an entity, which should be the long-term vision for a brand that's coming into the Vietnamese market. What retailers specifically are you going to be focusing on? So moving down to localization considerations. So when looking at localization, it's important to tread cautiously with how much you want to localize or think you need to localize for the Vietnamese market. Some markets in Southeast Asia, localization and developing the brand more tailored towards local need is oftentimes embraced. Let's take Thailand as a market, for example. In Vietnam, generally speaking, from an imported brand and product perspective, it's a lot better to take into consideration conserving your brand and product identity to what it is in the home market. Sure, you'll have variations of localization among big players in the market, such as Coca-Cola, Milo, etc. But Vietnamese consumers certainly do value and hold a price premium towards a foreign product. So it's important to take into consideration localization. So whether that is for a slogan or iconography or any type of characterization for market. But when it comes to packaging, your brand name, etc., your USPs, it's important to maintain that resilience with what the brand and product offering is in the home market. The localization from the marketing and branding perspective is very important to take into consideration. And I'll build on that component further in the session. So Oreo was a winner in 2020. They did quite a unique campaign where essentially customers would purchase the Oreo, which was a Tet, which is essentially the new year in Vietnam, which included a new flavor that was released over the period. Customers would find a music card that could be scanned with their phone and play traditional Chinese Vietnamese music. So they'd take a bite out of the cookie, they'd match an image shown on the screen, and then they'd get access to 5 exclusive songs from a famous Vietnamese musician. This was one of the top campaigns for that year, but shows you the level of localization that Oreo went for this particular campaign, but really connecting with Gen Z and millennial consumers, trying to go for that youthful demographic and connecting that with music and young culture. So looking at the different sales channels across Vietnam. So you have modern trade, general trade, HoReCa, convenience stores, traditional e-commerce and social commerce. Modern trade is generally where brands will play. That is the initial dip of the toe into the market and where you'll see most new brands and foreign brand presence in Vietnam. General trade, so that's speaking to wet markets, independent convenience stores, can be quite challenging to play into. They're extremely fragmented in Vietnam. There are new developments in terms of fulfillment into these spaces. Redfin has a partnership with Grab, which essentially helps products and brands get into general trade mom and pop type shops. If the brand and product works in their shops, they're able to buy it directly through the app, which allows fulfillment into that channel. Possible is HoReCa as well, through wholesalers. Traditional e-commerce, obviously very important. That said, if you look at the market share, and I'll speak a bit further on the development of TikTok as a platform in terms of social commerce and where TikTok wants to be positioning itself in terms of the e-commerce landscape in broadly speaking, in Vietnam. They have some very ambitious goals that they are looking very on target to achieve in terms of becoming the second biggest marketplace for e-commerce / social commerce in Vietnam. So this is a platform that we're keeping a very close eye on. Social commerce holistically in Vietnam is growing very quickly. But from a traditional e-commerce perspective, ensuring that you have your flagship or marketplace store on Shopee, Lazada, or Tiki is an initial touch point on e-commerce is very important as well. So looking at what you could say your vertical channels or modern trade channels that are focusing on specific categories. So we have the top 3 different category specific retail channels in Vietnam: mother and baby, apparel, healthcare, and household. Watson's has a very strong foothold throughout Vietnam. And then ACFC for apparel is very spread throughout the north, middle, and south. So when you're considering looking at your offline retail strategy and what offline distribution partners you want to be working with in the market, understanding their ability to fulfill products that are within your category that can go into these offline retail channels is very important. And I'll speak to more on the due diligence process of working with an importer or distributor a bit further in the session. Market entry methods. So this is quite vastly different to mainland China. As I mentioned, for brands that are entering this market, looking at the long-term plan to set up an entity is obviously where brands should be looking. As an initial touch point, there are a number of different options. You can work with a distributor. You can look at cross-border e-commerce. The thing with cross-border e-commerce in the Vietnamese market is that although it can be fulfilled from other markets, and throughout Southeast Asia, cross-border e-commerce is one of the largest in Vietnam. When you consider the size of e-commerce, which is 7% compared to total retail, it's not a long-term strategy. And Vietnamese consumers aren't as accustomed to purchasing through cross-border e-commerce. It can certainly be considered as a test and learn type initiative to get an understanding of what types of brands and products are working for your offering in the market, but it's not a long-term play. Cool. And establishing an entity. So generally speaking, for brands looking at the Vietnamese market, a limited liability company is recommended. Again, this is something Redfern can help you with. It's a fairly straightforward process, but an LLC is what we would generally recommend for brands that are looking at setting up and establishing a formal presence in market, and working with an authorized provider in this sphere is strongly recommended. As similarly with sort of the process that you have to go through to set up the company. Generally speaking, it's about 6 weeks. That includes all the documentation, licensing, administrative setup, tax registrations, bank account setup. Generally speaking, most brands that are looking to enter the market will work with a third party in this sphere. It's important to do your due diligence on the parties that you're dealing with. When it comes to corporate services in Vietnam, there are mixed bags of different providers, where some are very low cost and local, but would put emphasis similarly with China in the context where when you're setting up your entity in the market, that it's important to do it right the first time. There are additional elements to when you set up an entity that you can make refinements to scope, but it's very important that when you do the initial piece that it's done correctly, and you work with a provider that, one, has experience in the type of company that you are and the type of service scope that you want to accommodate for Vietnam, and two, can be a partner that you can work with cohesively moving forward as your scope of your business develops, or you want to add on certain elements. Moving forward, they can be a reliable partner in that sense. So choosing a local distributor. In terms of the category split when working with distributors in the market, it's a lot more consolidated in Vietnam when it comes to distribution options and different categories that exist in this market. Generally speaking, you want to look at an ethos very similarly to how you would assess a distributor in mainland China or other regions around Asia. You want to get a good understanding of what relationships do they have in specific channels. So as I'd shown previously, the different category specific channels and offline bricks and mortar stores. If you're a mother and baby brand that is looking to enter the Vietnamese market, you're wanting to make sure that your distributor has access and strong relationships within these channels. And then two, what other brands have they been working with? Are they able to share with you case studies of other brands that offer a similar product or have a similar positioning where they can show success in what they've done in terms of their distribution capabilities? A map of distribution partner and channel network. So within their own distribution network of sub-distributors, what capabilities do they have? If they're based in Ho Chi Minh, to what degree do they have fulfillment and distribution throughout Ho Chi Minh? Pricing, obviously getting a gauge of what relationship can you build with them in terms of balanced pricing. Generally speaking, from a wholesale perspective to distributor, it's roughly around 10% of total retail. Strong recommendation would be to consider a number of different partners, and Redfin Digital helps with this. Your local government trade agencies will be able to support with you on the ground here as well. But going through that due diligence process and understanding and making sure that the distributor ticks all the boxes in terms of having a similar alignment and being able to work, has experience with working with brands from a similar background is very important as well. Similarly with other markets, Vietnamese distributors, oftentimes their e-commerce and marketing capabilities aren't necessarily their strengths. Their forte is getting product into the hands of consumers offline and getting you exposure on the shelf. It's always important to ask that question in terms of, okay, we're going to formalize an agreement. What can they bring to the table in terms of offline marketing and helping to drive sales offline through initiatives and capabilities that they have in-house? If they have strong e-commerce and online marketing capabilities, that's a strong plus, but it's often can be a bit of a rarity that we see in this market. Certainly having strong capabilities in terms of offline sampling and POSM development to help facilitate and drive attraction to the brand and product in offline retail scenarios is very, very important. And I'm going to go through a few examples of different brands that are executing really well from an offline perspective. Milo is a standout, certainly in the Vietnamese market, one of my favorite brands. Their product diversification in Vietnam is phenomenal. They've got Milo ice creams and chocolate bars and all sorts. But when you walk into any type of offline retail store in Vietnam, you'll often find that they've got a very impressive sort of booth display and POSM set up to try and incentivize and drive that offline purchase. So as I mentioned, working with a distributor, they'll often negotiate with the brand the product price at 15 to 40% of the recommended retail price, generally 10 to 15%. And there'll also be a marketing rebate on purchasing order. So the investment that comes with actually investing into influencer campaigns, sampling, etc. Another important element is working with choosing the size of the distributor that you work with. They come in all shapes and sizes. Oftentimes going with your big distributors is not necessarily the way to go. Working with a smaller distributor with a tighter team that can dedicate more time and investment and effort into building your brand offline, we certainly see for some brands is often the way to go. Working with some of the massive players in the market, for brands that aren't necessarily performing from the get-go, they can often get a little bit left behind, and distributors can come, you could say, slightly disillusioned with the success of the brand. And it can be frustrating brand side when you've got a locked-in agreement for 1 or 2 years and your distributor isn't really coming to the table with support. Import regulations. So if you're setting up an entity, obviously you'd be wanting to work with a licensed and authorized and experienced agency, and ensuring that your products are certified and they meet the regulatory requirements for market. We're not going to go into category specific detail on the different requirements per category, because obviously they vary significantly between the different categories. But if you are setting up your own entity and are going to import the products yourself, you certainly want to be working with a licensed provider with a lot of experience in the space. If you are ultimately working with a distributor in the market, generally speaking, they will take care of the product self-declaration or registration of the product, the compliance, and then ultimately the customs clearance and payment to customers as well. I'm showing a map here of the different trade agreements, free trade agreements that Vietnam has with other regions around the world. Obviously, the UK VFTA was a bit more recent, and we're starting to see a lot more enthusiasm and interest from British brands that are looking to into the Vietnamese market. So it's important to consider understanding and knowing what free trade agreements your home country has in place for tax incentivizations and attractive investment coming into this market. Additionally, in Vietnam, there are a lot of high-tech parks, which operate similarly to what you could say a free trade zone is in mainland China, where brands and companies from certain regions around the world that may operate in certain categories can be offered incentivizations to invest in certain high-tech parks. There are a number on the outskirts of Ho Chi Minh, where we have medical or pharma brands, nutritional health brands that will have a base in these regions because they'll receive tax incentivizations and subsidies from the local government to operate their businesses out of these regions. So coming back to promotion and marketing. So when you're looking at the timeline for e-commerce marketing in mainland China, it's important that price sensitivity is particularly important. Evaluating and understanding what is your reasonable discount range going to be, and building in promotional periods, particularly between the likes of Tet, Shopee, Lazada. They run festivals such as 9/9, 11/11, 12/12, and Black Friday. So ensuring that you're working with your distributor if they're running e-commerce operations, or working closely with your marketing and e-commerce provider to ensure that you've got alignment in what your activities are going to be during these specific promotional periods. I won't go into this context too much detail. This will come in a later module, but if you look at the marketing approaches into mainland Vietnam, this is an example of what the flow of goods looks like from a brand that is importing into Vietnam from Singapore. So breaking down the different costing elements. As I mentioned, the cost of goods roughly should be about 10%. So you've got the actual manufacturing of the goods, the transportation, coming from the origin of port, destination of port price, and then ultimately the retail price. So when you look at the main channels in Vietnam, discounts can range between 20 to 30%. So getting that pricing structure in place before you go on your market entry journey into Vietnam is very important, because if you're expecting a higher price in this market, it's challenging. The price sensitivity among consumers here, particularly on e-commerce, is very high, and discounts are expected from an offline perspective as well. So moving on to looking at some of the e-commerce platforms in the market now. Shopee is obviously reigning supreme for the market. And I'll go into a bit more detail shortly on TikTok, because this is something that is very, very interesting from a consumer demand perspective, and really highlights how youthful the consumer market is and where it's going in Vietnam. Shopee certainly has the highest market share, followed by Lazada, TikTok Shops, and then Tiki, though TikTok is looking to take over Lazada and take second place within the next couple of years. Though at the current stage of where e-commerce is in Vietnam, having your marketplace store on Shopee, Lazada is strongly recommended, and then supplementing that with strong investment into your TikTok shop as well, due to the drive of social commerce in the market. So social commerce in Vietnam is largely driven by TikTok. You have Tiki mini apps as well, but generally speaking, it is very much driven by your Gen Z, your millennial consumers. With TikTok, one of the reasons why it's such a powerful platform for new brands that are coming into market is that it forces young consumers to be exposed to your brand or product. If you were to take, from an example perspective, let's take Little Red Book in China, which is very much a search-driven platform. TikTok is a platform where consumers during the day, they will scroll through content, and you're able to get your product in front of a new consumer. So that is why it is so, the consumption of e-commerce is so driven by younger consumers, your Gen Z and your millennials. And this is what's essentially accelerating the consumption and ultimately the purchase of products through TikTok. When we look at key categories that are performing very well on TikTok shops. You've got personal care, beauty, cosmetics, food and beverage, fashion. But for many of the brands and products that are being offered, they're targeting that younger consumer demographic. They've got a low price point. They're not leaning towards that luxury or premium segment of the market, and they're remaining extremely price sensitive. As I mentioned, TikTok is planning to be the second highest platform by market share. So it's not a platform that brands can ignore. For brands that we're working with in the market, as I mentioned, we focus on the core marketplaces for all the core e-commerce marketplaces. So your Lazada and your Shopee, and then TikTok is something that we're starting to motivate our brands to get involved with. But that also comes back to the brand product selection and pricing. Consumers on TikTok are very young, they're very price sensitive, but from a volume and proportion of total social commerce and broadly speaking e-commerce sales, it's a very important platform for brands to keep an eye out on. And this comes back to the importance of video content and how you can speak to the Vietnamese consumer, the importance of good video content for TikTok. Many brands will look to take content that they've used in other markets, localize it to a certain extent, edit, sub it for market, and won't necessarily go through investing in the process of developing good quality localized content. It's not necessary quite to the degree as, for example, Douyin content is in China, but it's certainly recommended for brands to look at, one, developing some good medium quality tier videos to post on their own platforms, but also working with different influencers, what I'm going to touch on shortly, to help get that brand reach out to target consumer, and then also being able to repost content from influencers on TikTok through their own channels as well. Pricing for influencers in TikTok, Instagram, Facebook very significantly. You'll see that with TikTok, the price point is significantly higher than other platforms. This is essentially because if you look at the size of the follower base, you can see that TikTok is massive here. Now, this is something that brands need to take into consideration when it comes to understanding what platforms these influencers are active on. Facebook is still very, very big in Vietnam. And when you look at some KOLs that have a strong presence on TikTok, for example, oftentimes they may actually have a stronger presence on Facebook. So equating which channels you want the KOL to be posting through is very important as well. Reflecting back on the core categories, you've got fashion and beauty, entertainment and hobbies, food and beverage. So you'll see that these are still the core categories that are being tailored towards for promotional spend. Instagram is still an important channel for brands in the market, but predominantly we see a lot of paid promotion through TikTok and Facebook. Another important element that I just want to touch on, which I didn't touch on for video content, is YouTube Shorts, which are also increasing in popularity in Vietnam as well, though it's still very much driven by TikTok. So we've got some examples here of different brand building tactics and strategies that you can look at doing for market. IP and characterization is one of the top winners for market. Going back to that young consumer, they want an identity or a character that they can have resonate with them as a young consumer. Merchandising, so coming up with innovative gift with purchase type options, developing tailored merchandise that supplements the usability and the function of what your product and brand represents in the consumer's lifestyle. Adds a lot of value among consumers. It also comes back to that value add that is important for Vietnamese consumers. Customized packaging and gift boxes. So these are quite typical during the likes of Tet and specific festivals throughout the calendar year for e-commerce. So developing gift box sets or tailored merchandise and box concepts is a useful tactic that is being embraced by a lot of local brands here. That's something that foreign companies can certainly look at developing themselves, but really it's important to base these around certain periods and times of the year. So the example that I was referring to earlier in the session is the offline events, pop-up stores, and POSM. So you'll see the examples here with Milo and beverage brand, this matcha brand. Essentially, what they have done as that has been so effective in incentivizing purchase of products in offline retailers, they'll do an excessive amount of sampling. They'll have a very standout booth with free sampling of product, discount coupons to help drive that offline purchase in the main bricks and mortar retail stores. This is a very, very important element of an offline strategy in Vietnam, and looking at what can you do to better engage with and attract the attention of the consumer while they're shopping in offline retail, as it's such a big proportion of total retail in itself. So test and learn. So this is something that all brands need to go through once they have actually launched. You have your offline bricks and mortar retail channels in place. You have your e-commerce and social commerce marketplaces established. Now is the process that you kick off called the test and learn, where you get an understanding of what works for you when it comes from an ROI and investment into the platforms. From an e-commerce perspective, this is for when we are supporting a client from an e-commerce perspective. We test a number of different variables in that first 6 weeks, and the variables and how we evaluate them over that period really help to evaluate what we're doing for the brand in the market, and then also help to quantify how we're going to measure KPIs. So if we're looking at e-commerce, understanding what types of key visuals, what content, what design of landing page works the best for sales conversion, and then adapting and analyzing the strategy and developing the store based on what we see from the data. What are we seeing the most click-through to conversion from? The similar perspective and approach can be taken from looking at off-platform marketing. So if you're running influencer campaigns on TikTok or Instagram, getting an understanding of what type of KOLs are doing what for your brand. Are there specific types that will be clearly driving sales on your e-commerce or social commerce marketplaces? Are there certain profiles of KOLs that are particularly good at building brand awareness and engagement among the social media platforms? So that intensive 6-week test and learn period is crucial to getting an understanding of what works and what helps resonate and drive sales with your target consumers in Vietnam. That also helps you to ongoing refine determining what high performance content looks like for your brand in the market. So some key tips just around business etiquette and Vietnamese culture. Punctuality is very important. I've learned that the hard way somewhat. Introductions through mutual connections preferred over cold calls. So that relationship element is very important. Handshakes, again, are normal in terms of business greetings. Having a loose or friendly dialogue before starting business proceedings is accepted and embraced and appropriate in that business context environment. And don't point. When gesturing, avoid pointing with a single finger and use your entire hand, because pointing can be considered quite offensive. Again, order of seniority is important when exchanging business cards or during introductions as well. So wrapping up in terms of the key takeaways, Vietnam as a market is growing rapidly, growing GDP, middle class and economy. It doesn't have the competition of foreign brands like the China market does. It's nowhere near at the saturation level that China is. But the pie is structured in a very, very different way. Approaching the Vietnamese market is not like China. Looking at it from a e-commerce marketplace perspective, as I'll recap, e-commerce is only 7% of total retail here. So offline strategy is very, very important. Vietnam is a great landing pad for further expansion into other markets, such as Thailand, Indonesia, etc. Labor and manufacturing costs in Vietnam are much lower. So for brands that may be looking to use OEM manufacturing and develop brands and products in the Vietnamese market, costs are significantly less. We come across many brands who will take their ingredients and product profiles and now are looking to develop the products in Vietnam. Important to consider the youthfulness of consumers in Vietnam, particularly when it comes to e-commerce and the channels that these consumers are active on, and how you tailor your branding and marketing strategy to tailor to their needs and resonate with them as young consumers. Some of the challenges of Vietnam, it can be quite slow in terms of policy and some of the red tape, depending on the category that you operate in. There are government restrictions on foreign investment, but this certainly varies by category, and JV partnerships are not uncommon for certain industries. Lack of understanding in culture and region and regions in Vietnam, certainly something we see with companies having a team on the ground here is very important, both from a cultural perspective, but also having an understanding of the cultural dynamics that come with business operations and business etiquette. Again, pricing, which we've touched on quite a lot through the session. SEA is not homogenous. It's not. Do not look at wider Southeast Asia customs and cultures as being something that's reflective across all of Southeast Asia, because that's simply not the case. And Vietnam is very culturally diverse across regions, the north and south, in terms of flavor profiles, product preference, price sensitivity. They vary. So it's important to take that into consideration when you're looking at your overall strategy and how you're going to target regions in the north, south, and center. So making acknowledgements in your brand and product strategy for market, and looking at Vietnam as a segmented region with varying different consumer segments throughout the entire country is very important. Okay, so we're coming to the end of the session now. Thank you everybody for joining today. Sandra, I think there may be a question or two in the chat. I'm not sure.
A couple came through. Let me just reclaim host. And then while I set up the screen for the to have your contact details, I'll just go ahead and ask the first question. So that's the first question is, you talked a little bit about TikTok and in the context of e-commerce and social commerce, but this question has to do with building a social media presence and if it's important in Vietnam, and then at what stage of the market entry process should brands start to consider building that social media presence?
It's a good question. Generally speaking, you want to be putting a media plan in place when you are going to ultimately launch, and you have a date that you're going to be active in the market. So brands will not necessarily invest significantly before they launch. You may want to do some preheat, you could say, between let's say 1 to 2 months before you actually launch on e-commerce or offline retail, just to get some footprint and activeness on the key social media platforms that you're focusing on. But you really don't want to be investing significantly until, your retail channels, both online and offline, are in place. It can frustrate consumers, where if you're investing too much in marketing and consumers can't buy your product, it can ultimately be detrimental. But it's not uncommon for brands to invest very lightly in terms of some product seeding with influencers, doing some small campaigns to announce that this brand is coming to market, just to create a bit of hype and buzz around the launch.
Mm-hmm. And then the next question is, should a brand launch on e-commerce first, or should they launch offline first?
No, you want to look at a dual-pronged strategy. You need offline retail, and hence why the importance of working with a capable distributor to get you into the right channels is important. E-commerce is as I mentioned, 7% of total retail. So having that combination of the consumer being able to go into a bricks and mortar store, buy the product, and then being able to purchase it online is very important. But yeah, you want to have a dual approach with this market, and that largely comes back to the with let's say take China for an example. Cross-border e-commerce in Vietnam is still very underdeveloped. It is a model that exists, but it's a smaller portion of e-commerce, which is small in its own right. So hence emphasizing the importance of that offline retail play.
Mm-hmm. And then one question is there a library or registration of distributors by product category?
No. So generally speaking, that's through relationships, partners, trade offices. So your local trade office in Ho Chi Minh or Hanoi. We work very closely with a number of them in market, NZTE, Austrade, DBT, and all of these organizations are there on the ground in Vietnam to help connect you with potential distributors, as well as chambers of commerce that are on the ground in Vietnam as well.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, that's actually also a service that we offer. Like we're able to go through our network and introduce brands to distributors as needed as well.
Yeah.
And then another question has to do with, can you sell cross-border on TikTok in Vietnam with, yeah.
Not yet.
Mm-hmm.
There are still quite a few regulations in place, depending on the category with TikTok, social commerce in Vietnam. For cross-border e-commerce, it's predominantly through Lazada, and that's because it's through the Alibaba network. So you can actually fulfill products through Tainiao, the Alibaba e-commerce logistics provider. But again, the proportion of market share that cross-border e-commerce has, it's really not something that we would recommend most brands to start with.
Yeah, and then another question has to do with Vietnamese localization. So is a Vietnamese name 100% necessary? And what level of localization do brands need when they enter Vietnam?
So in terms of the localization of a brand name, it doesn't hurt to develop a Vietnamese name when you're looking at entering the market and registering your English or your foreign brand name trademark. Ultimately, Vietnamese consumers will adopt and develop a localized name for you at a certain point once you've developed a footprint in the market. So actually developing your own Vietnamese name that can then be used on e-commerce and marketing and branding initiatives, not on product packaging, will then educate consumers that they can refer to your brand as this name. Otherwise, what can happen is consumers will develop a name, the brand may not become aware of it, and then there'll be a third party that goes and registers the trademark for it when Vietnamese consumers know that this is your brand name in Vietnamese, but you don't technically own the name, which can be a frustrating process.
Let me just have a look. And what is the best way to understand price competitiveness in Vietnam?
So there are two methodologies you can use for this. There's looking at both the core channels, offline and then online. Competitor benchmarking, so looking at what are your competitors selling at, shortlisting 5 to 6 different brands or product offerings that you see are of a similar value and offering and positioning to your product, and doing the offline due diligence, going into offline retail and seeing what competitor products are selling at, how they're bundling their products, are there any merchandise that they're also offering with products, what is their discounting strategy, and then looking on e-commerce as well. So we help brands with this from both channels in terms of pricing. With e-commerce, you can crawl data online to get an understanding of price point of products across different categories over X periods of time. That will give you a gauge on, okay, these are the 5 brands or products that you want to look at that you see as your competitors on the main marketplaces in Vietnam. What are the top 5? So if there are 5 brands that you see as competitors, what are the top 5 products that they're selling in their portfolio, and then what is the average retail price, and then what is the average discounting price that they're selling at, and that will give you a bit of a gauge of what your competitors are selling at.
And then another question has to do with the you mentioned a pricing expectation of 15 to 40% for working with distributors. What is the expectation for the beauty category? And we can also reach out with more details afterwards to anybody who asks really specific category specific questions as well.
I would say between 20 to 25, but it really depends on the product offering. The beauty category is so diverse in terms of mass market type products, and then your very functional cosmeceutical type products. So it's hard to say. It really depends on the brand or product, but happy to give some guidance on the brand or product that you might be referring to following the session.
Yeah, we have had a couple other questions come through, but we're running a little bit late on time. So I'm going to go ahead and we'll reach out. And a lot of them are very specific to different categories. So we'll definitely reach out by email and then answer the questions after the webinar session. So Ashwin's details are on the screen right now. You can see his email and feel free to reach out as well if you have any additional questions that come up afterwards. The recording will be shared to everyone who joined today afterwards as well, and it will be put up on our YouTube channel for future access, so you can always come back and watch the recording. And then While I still have you, I would like to talk a little bit about the Vietnam Brand Incubator Program that we are currently accepting applications for. So we're actually running this. This is going to be next week. So this is kind of the last call for anybody who wants to register and who'd be interested in applying for it. So it's going to be a series of different workshops. The first workshop is going to be on market entry, except it will be a little bit more tailored to the specific categories of the brands that join. So this session right now was quite general. So the session next week will be tailored to the actual brands who are part of this program. And then we'll have the different workshops, each working on a different aspect of brand entry into Vietnam, covering e-commerce, media, and distributors. And then afterwards, we'll also hold a consumer panel for the different products of the brands that are involved in this, and provide individualized brand assessments, and then discussions, one-on-one discussions with our specialists here. So the main speakers of these workshops will be Ryan Malloy and Ashwin. And so please do apply afterwards, and the link for this will also be sent to everyone alongside the recording later today, once both of those are up. And if you're interested, do apply. We'd love to see you join. And with that, I think that's everything from my end. Thank you so much for the webinar, Ashwin, and thank you everyone for joining.
Thank you everybody for joining, and thanks, Sandra.